Hello. It's the 29th of January, 2016, and this is episode 41 of the Unseen Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Carr, and with me tonight is Adam Smith.
Hello from tomorrow.
Hello, Adam. And also, James Garrison.
Hello, everyone. Good to be back.
Yeah, good to have you back, James, through all the ice tornadoes and everything, earthquakes. And Mike Bohler.
Hello, everyone.
And Patrick Festa.
Hello, everyone from the garbage state.
At least you have water you can drink, Patrick.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
That's not really a joke, you know.
Not funny. I know. Okay. Tonight we're going to talk about commercial space. This has been a good month for the Unseen Podcast, and thanks for listening. If you're out there listening, please subscribe. If you want to know anything more about the Unseen Podcast, go to unseenpodcast.com, and everything you need to know is there. We are a spinoff of the Wow Signal Podcast. Go to wowsignalpodcast.com to learn more about that. It's also been a very good month for the Wow Signal Podcast. I've been pretty obsessed with the whole Tabby Star story lately, so I have to admit this has been my second priority as comes to podcast, but fortunately some people chimed in on the topics thread, including Adam and James and Patrick, and we had the discussion of what should we we always start this thread about 3 weeks out from the podcast, and we ask ourselves, what should we talk about? Because I want it to be not just me, I want to be other people to chime in. And I think where we've kind of landed is we're talking about commercial space. We talk a lot about on this podcast about where NASA's doing or what the academic community is doing, but we don't talk that much about and we talk a little bit about what SpaceX is up to, because SpaceX always seems to be the headline grabber. But there are other companies that are not just building launch vehicles, but building other types of systems to not only explore space, but to exploit space, like planetary resources. There are companies that are building space tourism platforms like Virgin Galactic, and then there are people competing with NASA contracts like Sierra Nevada and Blue Origin. So, who wants to start? Where are we? Let me tell you, compared to where we were when I started in the space business a long time ago, yeah, in 1981, I'll say 82 to make it a little more accurate. We're a lot further along commercial space. Back then, what commercial space companies did was build spacecraft for NASA and the Department of Defense and others, government agencies, and build communication satellites. We are a lot further along than that. Who wants to have a go? Where do you think we are?
I think.
Go ahead, Adam.
Go on.
I was going to say we're just now getting to the point where, Blue Origin has successfully had a couple of launches and landings of a rocket. Who was SpaceX tried to duplicate it, and unfortunately they had a failure on their landing. But we're getting to the point where everything's not just on the drawing board anymore. They're actually got hardware going up and coming back successfully.
Yeah. Now those are actually two different things, right? SpaceX is trying to reuse a booster that is already done its job. It's launched a payload into space. It has to do a very difficult supersonic retro burn and then come down and land. And they did successfully land on the ground recently. but they failed. Recently, they failed to land. They actually landed on the barge, but then a leg gave way and they fell over. The landing was actually on the barge was very impressive. They landed smack right in the middle of the barge, and then it's almost like out of a cartoon. It just falls right over and it blows up.
It's interesting because I was actually talking to some general public people. I do hangouts on Google and the layman people. One guy was actually suggesting somebody like me who was a science enthusiast, he was actually suggesting it's because that they're trying to reuse the space rocket. Excuse me. That maybe we can stabilize the platform because they're trying to land this thing on the ocean and there's waves and the platform is basically unstable. He was suggesting something gyroscopic to stabilize the platform.
Well, they already do that. I mean, they have. Trust me, it is gyroscopically. I mean, the vehicle is gyroscopically stabilized. The platform is about.
The actual platform.
Yeah, it's about as stable as it can get. Given, I mean, that was actually pretty calm seas at the time.
This was more a matter of metal fatigue or something.
There was a problem with the leg.
Wasn't it?
Yeah, and they're still analyzing that, and we don't really know exactly what that was.
That was an unmanned.
Oh yeah. The landing of the booster is always going to be unmanned. That is, I mean, because they know it's hazardous. If you look at the animation of the Falcon Heavy launch, you'll see Falcon Heavy is basically 3 Falcon 9s strapped together, and they all come back down. Now, the reason why they have to land on the barge is because for high energy launches, they can't get back to Florida. They've gone too far out. So they have to come back on the barge. And they're obviously still working out the technology there.
I just want to know, because I'm monitoring the Q&A, that our friend Ciro Villa, said that they actually have a design to have wires locking the booster in place upon landing.
Yeah, there is a design for that. Yeah, and I don't know I'm not sure SpaceX has that design, but I have seen a design that would sort of grab the booster after it lands. You really shouldn't need that. The legs should work just fine, but yeah, it wouldn't hurt. But the whole idea of the barge is that for high energy launches like geosynchronous launches, when they're sending a communication satellite out to a much higher orbit, then they need the barge. Now, if they're just going to resupply the space station, they don't need the barge. They can come back to Florida. And I'm not sure what they do at Vandenberg. That's a different story. If they're out in Vandenberg, where they're putting in satellites into polar orbits, then that's. But the whole idea is what, right? What they're trying to do is cut cost, right? Radically cut the cost of a launch vehicle by really reusing, not just like pretending to reuse, but really reusing a whole bunch of launch equipment, and rather than just building a new one. And that promises to be a very significant launch cost cut. Already, SpaceX has cut launch costs way more than anybody would have thought they could have done, by a factor of 3 or 4. Even for a NASA launch, NASA launches are there's a tremendous amount of paperwork burden. There's a lot of costs there, which anybody, SpaceX or anyone else, would have to absorb. But even then, you still have a huge savings in terms of dollars per kilogram to orbit. And
the thing I like about SpaceX is their openness. They're very open about what they do. There's no secrecy, or very little secrecy, compared to the other companies like Boeing and even Blue Origin. They keep what they're doing quite quiet. SpaceX, I mean, people say that they're too publicity oriented, but I don't think that's a bad thing. They're not afraid to publicize a booster rocket coming down and falling over. You know, the mission itself was still a success. They orbited the Jason 3, was it, satellite, perfectly, and I think they should be applauded for their openness. They're not afraid to show everyone what they're about.
If they can achieve reusability.
I agree with Adam, and I find their openness refreshing. I do think that they need to look at their. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm no expert, but it seems to me that they've been having a problem with stabilization of the actual landing and the tilting. Somewhere along the line, there's some technical thing going on. They need to look into that. But yeah, I'm definitely with Adam in their. It's refreshing to see the openness and the invisibility.
They stuck the landing this last time. They stuck it, but then the leg failed. So, they have more work to do, but the way they've done this, which is really actually more reminiscent of the old school way back in the 40s and 50s when we built X-planes, right? We would build one, fail, kill a test pilot, although that was often not publicized, and then figure out how to do it better and do it and not go operational until you had something that was really, really working. What they've done is that they're getting the job done. They're putting the satellite in orbit. Then they're doing a developmental test. And people should not confuse the operational placement of the satellite in orbit with the developmental test. Those are two completely separate things. And
and it's also about, like we've always said in science of anything, failure is also an accomplishment. Like when you see something go wrong, you learn from it.
Right, and you learn by making mistakes. And a lot of people don't get that. They don't realize how many mistakes have to precede success and repeatability. And there was a time when SpaceX had multiple launch failures in a row.
I have a question from Nick Nielsen. Is the vertical landing of boosters first imagined in 1950s science fiction films and now being realized by Blue Origin and SpaceX something only made possible by contemporary technology, or might have it been done earlier if it just moved up on me, or have it, where am I lost my place, or have it done earlier if only the effort was made?
Right. Well, that's a good question. I don't have a 100% sure answer on that, but I can tell you that today it is a lot easier because it is so much easier to design high bandwidth control systems and implement them now than it used to be. Was it doable back in the 1960s? Probably. I mean, they did a lot of amazing things back then. They probably would have had a pilot flying it down. Because back then they believed in test pilots. They believed in these guys are dispensable, and they would have.
The big difference today is the guidance computers. We have. Excellent.
They're so much better than they used to be. So much. I mean, even in the 80s, the guidance computers were pretty crude by today's standards. But with maybe you might have 4K of RAM, 4K, not 4 gigs, 4K, 4 millionths, 1 millionth of what you have now. On a typical flight computer now can easily have a gig of RAM, maybe more. Just as any amateur can go out and buy 4 gigs of RAM for a cheap PC. Even radiation hardened RAM isn't that expensive, and the processors are so much faster. And so the control system designer is freed up to do whatever he or she needs to do to make the control system work.
Well, it reminds me a lot of the stealth fighters. I mean, you're trying to fly a brick, and the computer is pretty much running that whole plane. The pilot's there mostly to set the direction, you know. So I mean, that's the impressive part about the technology. It's not just, you know, it's this you know, the advanced you know, the ability for the plane to read where it's at, how it's going up, down, you know, what it's doing, and then compensate, you know, subtly, whatever, however it does it.
Well, the fly-by-wire of the stealth fighter from the 70s was an inspiration for a lot of other things. I mean, because that was an amazing achievement, but that they did it with the 70s technology that they had. And they, because if I recall correctly, the stealth fighter adjusted 40 times a second all its control surfaces. These days that would be trivial, but back then that was really an amazing achievement. And you know, and I've read the book by Ben Rich where he describes that, and they flew a stealth fighter right past a radar installation and it didn't pick it up. So,
and if I may say one more thing about Cyril Villa says, I think there was not enough effort and focus on a return landing. I think it could have been implemented sooner. That was Cyril Villa.
Return landing?
Yeah, his exact words are, I think there was not enough. Oop, I lost it. Where'd it go? Sorry, Cyril. There it is. I think there was not enough effort and focus on return landing. I think it could have been implemented sooner. That was Cyril Villa.
Well, he may be right about that, but
it's was it in the right stuff? I mean, the scientists weren't concerned about landing; they just wanted to get it into the ocean. It seemed like, but the test pilots saying, "Hey, we want to control it." I mean, I think the last Mercury landing, Cooper put the capsule like within a few thousand yards of the carrier he was supposed to get picked up by, you know. So I think there was there was I mean, there might have been a disconnect between the scientists who were just interested in getting up and then the pilots who wanted to get back down. I mean, maybe that's
right. Well, that was part of the trade-off. I mean, right? I mean, they weren't thinking, oh my gosh, we have to cut the cost of this booster by flying it back, you know.
Yeah.
It was more like, this is a huge national priority. Let's cutting the cost is not a big deal. And then with the space shuttle, it was a completely different thing. Well, we'll just land it on a runway, right? Well, but then to do that, you've got to fly wings into space where they're of no use, and a whole lot of other control systems and landing gear, which are of no use in space, and then fly it back. So you just end up with a massive amount of launch cost. So what you really have to do is take the same system that gets you into space to bring you back. And that's been the SpaceX innovation. Actually, the DCX that came way before that in the 90s had the same vision, but they never got the funding to make it a real system. SpaceX is the genius of their idea is use the funding you're already getting to fly payloads into space to help support this effort of bringing boosters back. And then once you've got that, then you can cut the cost of the booster so much that you make a lot of money and you can beat any competitor. And right now, nobody else is doing it. Yeah, go ahead.
It helps that Elon Musk can, in effect, do what he likes. It's not a public company. He doesn't have stock holders that he needs to please. He can do more or less what he wants. You know, he can plow back the money that SpaceX makes into further development, for missions to go to the moon, to go to Mars. And
Right.
they're doing it.
Yeah, but I mean, there are investors in SpaceX, but I think they're happy with what he's done, and he's made them money in terms of the value of their investment. That they are very happy with what he's done for them, but he doesn't have to deal with Wall Street, which are a bunch of idiots who try to get you to produce a good quarterly profit every quarter, which doesn't work for this kind of long-term vision.
Yeah, I think that the problem with commercial space in the early days, in the 80s and the 90s, was that it takes so much money. You need such a lot of money to invest in a space program that it's really only the advent of billionaires, multi-billionaires, that's been able to achieve these things. Richard Branson with Virgin Galactic, Elon Musk with SpaceX. They've got ridiculous amounts of money to throw at.
Yeah, well, I was just looking. Apple Computer has $216 billion in cash. Okay, that's really more money than the U.S. government has to be able to throw around. I mean, the U.S. government has more cash than that, but they have it all spoken for. A lot of it, in dropping bombs on Afghanistan. So you have these private concerns, and Apple's not the only one. There's Google and other companies that have huge reserves of cash. With $216 billion, you could fund a cruise Mars mission. I mean, that's how big that amount of money is. Especially if you said, we're going to do this at a level of risk that is commensurate with the ambition of the mission, rather than a level of risk that's delusionally zero, which would never will be, right? So now, of course, Apple's not going to do that. Apple's going to keep that money in foreign banks and make their shareholders rich with it. But that kind of money is out there. It exists. And the amount of money that Elon Musk actually controls is a whole lot less than that, but it's still enough to move one step at a time.
Yeah.
I think, let's see, the SpaceX market cap right now is, well, you can't buy SpaceX stock. But I think SpaceX is valued at around $12 billion, which is
that's less than I would have thought, actually.
Well, that valuation does not really take into account long-term growth. It just, what could you sell it for, right?
Yeah.
And of course, there's a lot of caveats and all that. But I think Musk invested something like $200 million in it, so of his own money. So that's a big payoff. When I say $200 million, I don't really know if that's correct or not. So
More change for him, I would imagine.
Well, no, it wasn't actually, because he was also investing in Tesla at the same time.
Yeah,
so
of course.
He pretty much he made all his money on PayPal, and then he put that money into Tesla and SpaceX, and he's also put money into his solar energy venture. So I don't think he lives like Donald Trump. He lives. I'm sure he's not hurting for grocery money, but a lot of his money is in is in those investments, and it's done well. Tesla's done well after some initial rough patches, and his solar stuff is doing well.
Apparently, he's announced just this week that he intends to go into space himself aboard one of his Dragon capsules.
Yeah. Well, why else would you do that? I mean,
yeah. Why not?
I mean,
it's a no-brainer, really, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. Yes. I mean, why be a billionaire if you can't go into space? I mean, that's really, I mean, that is the 21st century, right? No point in being a billionaire unless you can go into space.
Yeah.
Or at least your children can go into space. I mean, I feel sorry for people like George Soros, who doesn't want to go into space.
Well, I mean, I'm the kind of person that doesn't want to go into space because of physical reasons. I would love to see things, but I'm the kind of guy who needs the comforts of home kind of thing, and I'd be afraid to, but certainly there are reasons why we don't want to go into space.
Okay, you can give me your billions, Patrick, and I'll do it.
Well, yeah, I mean, if somebody paid me enough, sure. But yeah, there's.
You could imagine. You could.
Can you imagine me not being able to reach my refrigerator for that beer?
There's a Spanish company, Patrick, that's offering high altitude balloon rides to the edge of space. They're called Zero to Infinity, and they've employed the former NASA astronaut Michael Lopez Alegria, I think that's how you pronounce his name, for a cost of €110,000, which is something
just
like $85,000, I think.
Yeah, it's just pocket change for me, you know.
Well, I mean, that's a lot cheaper than a house in Maryland.
Yeah, they're offering to take people just to the edge of space, not as far as the Kármán line, which is 100 kilometers up. So I would guess they'd take you to somewhere between 50 and 100 kilometers up, so that you can see the sky fade to black. And they're even offering private compartments for couples.
Uh-oh.
Which is interesting.
Sold, man.
Yeah.
Your marriage needs a little bit of a revival. That's where to go.
I wouldn't like to be the cleaner.
Paul, I don't know if you saw the side chat. I suggested something in the functionality of this Hangout. It would be great help to me because I'm supposed to be monitoring the question and answer. It would be helpful to me if you can mark the answered questions.
I'm sorry. I wasn't monitoring that because I was watching the recording, which is kind of my job. But
yeah, I don't have control over it, so I can't mark it. You know, I can't say this is answered.
Oh, okay. Let me bring that up. See.
So the other company that just recently has nailed a landing is Blue Origin, of course.
Yeah.
Who they recently demonstrated the reusability of their New Shepard test vehicle, which is intended to take passengers on suborbital flights. And they very impressively flew the New Shepard up to the Kármán line, just over the Kármán line. I think they got it up to about 101 kilometers, which is, officially into space, into low Earth orbit at about Mach 3, and then brought it back down again and nailed the landing perfectly. Very impressive.
Yes. Now, they didn't actually drop off a payload while we were there up there, but of course it was suborbital. But
I think it's fair to say that what SpaceX has done is far more difficult. Nailing the landing of their Falcon booster rocket is extremely difficult and much more impressive a feat. But Blue Origin are doing their thing.
Yes, they are.
I like their company motto, Gradatim Ferocitor, which means step by step ferociously.
I like that too.
That's their company's policy, basically, taking it one step at a time. They're going to take people into low Earth orbit, and from there, they're going to take people around the moon, and eventually they hope to take people to Mars.
Well,
and things are looking good for Blue Origin.
Yeah, I mean, the Mars thing is a bit of a stretch from where they are at the moment, but
sure.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we never know what the killer app is going to be until we get going. I mean, when people first came to America, nobody thought the killer app would be tobacco. It turned out to be tobacco. That was what we shipped back to England and other countries in Europe. That turned out to be what paid for everything else.
I'm experiencing deja vu. We've talked about this, and you've said the exact same thing last time about tobacco.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're looking for a killer app, right? The killer app may be tourism. Even though, you know, gosh, it's not as lofty as science. Well, there'll always be some money to pay for space science and astronomy. We've talked about that many times about, you know, the James Webb Space Telescope and other lesser missions or even missions beyond that. But when we're talking about what we'll pay for the development of cheap access to space and repeatable, frequent access to space, it may well turn out to be tourism.
Yeah. Space tourism is nothing new. It's quite an old idea.
Yeah, it's been around for a while.
There are waiting lists for trips to the moon that are about 50 years old now. Unfortunately, people are still waiting for the trip to the moon.
Yeah.
But, it's something that's been building since the 60s.
Right. Well, I mean,
the
we all
problem
remember
with the barrier
Gerard.
has always been money.
Remember Gerard K. O'Neill's book, The High Frontier, where you had, you know, one of the big attractions to going to this big habitable module in orbit in L5 was zero G sex, and you know, that may be what sells everybody on going to orbit. You know, we're human beings. We're not robots. We want to have fun. We want to experience wonder. We want to experience what it's like to be not on Earth. And it may be that's what we will do, just as porn paid for the internet. Tourism may pay for space.
Well, you know, it's not only about tourism though. It's, you know, as this commercial space venture goes on, it's also about working and jobs and things. So as the tourism is usually the first step, I guess. Maybe I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but it's going to be then. There's going to be job availability, you know, employment availability in space because of the tourism, and then there's going to be the mining and all that stuff that goes on. But it's SpaceX and the other companies also are on the forefront of starting that. Well,
as Mike Mongo will tell you, Mike Mongo goes around to these classrooms all the time and tells people, tells kids, you're going to work in space. You're going to be an astronaut. That's going to be a job that's available to you no matter what kind of specialty you work in, whether you're a musician or a poet or a teacher or an engineer, and start preparing for that now. And that really is kind of the vision.
There's a project called Space Island, which aimed to put 20,000 people. Their initial aim was to put 20,000 people into space by 2020. I mean, that isn't going to happen. But initially, they wanted to put 20,000 people onto a big space station in low Earth orbit by 2020, and then double the number of people every decade, and have it as a standalone commercial hub in low Earth orbit.
Mm-hmm.
One of the projects was centered around gathering solar energy from orbit and beaming it down to receiver stations on Earth. And then they would have asteroid mining initiatives and all sorts of commercial ventures in Earth orbit. As far as I'm aware, the project is still alive. They haven't
You know what I find?
began building the station. But
You know what I find? Everything that you're saying, Adam, is all valid, but things, everything turns into something else sooner or later. But what we're at now is that we're at a cusp of change, and the commercial, SpaceX and the other companies that are doing the commercial space flights are at the cusp of changing things. For example, the change that came from the industrialization, from fossil fuels, all of a sudden, the ideas were there and all these grand ideas these people were having, but all of a sudden there was jobs that needed to be done, like the people who worked on the drilling oil sites and the jobs that had to do with building the cars and I'm basically squashing a couple hundred years into a small sentence here, but the point I'm trying to make is that there are those dreams and there are those visions, and there are companies that are doing this change, doing this projects to change these things, like SpaceX is doing this commercial space flight and everything. But what actually comes up in about 50 years from now or 100 years from now is going to be a little different. But the fact is that they're the ones that actually started the process of starting a whole new type of civilization. We're going to start. Human beings are going to be working in space sooner or later, and these things are actually going to start happening. And we're at the cusp of that process of change. That's very interesting. We can't predict what's going to happen, or we can try to predict it, but we don't actually know for sure. We're going to see some surprises. But yeah, we are at the cusp of change.
have any of you guys seen The Expanse, the TV show?
Which one?
Yes.
Say
The
again?
Expanse.
No.
The Expanse. Yeah.
It's excellent.
Oh yeah, I've got. I set my DVR to record it, but I haven't watched any of the series yet.
It is excellent. The science is spot on. There's asteroid mining. There's a base on Ceres. There's a base on Mars. I mean, it's fiction, but it's got some really good, spot on science behind it. I'm very impressed with that.
Well, good. I intend to watch it. So, good. I mean, I really think asteroid mining is kind of the industrial heart of the future there, but there's an awful lot that has to happen to make a real economy in space. And as always, we don't really know what's going to be the driver there. I mean,
well, right. That's what I'm saying. In other words, we don't really know, but it has to all start from somewhere, and it is starting with SpaceX and companies.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, cut the cost of getting into space. Just cut it in half, and SpaceX has already done that. Really, cut it in half again, and new apps will pop up that nobody had thought of. I haven't thought of, you haven't thought of, nobody has.
Well, exactly. That's what that's why I say we're on the cusp. We're experiencing, we're in the generation, us old guys here, we're all looking at stuff that is just starting. Maybe it'll happen before we die, and we'll have the wonderful opportunity to see the change. Maybe we won't. Maybe we'll be dead before it actually happens. But the fact is that history is being made right now.
Right. Now, I have to point out that when I was a young engineer in the early 1980s, we all believed that the space shuttle was going to cut the cost of access to space. It didn't happen. Well, I mean, that part of that was the space shuttle was sold that way, but that really wasn't the real reason for it. It wasn't the real, and nobody inside really believed that was going to happen. But, so we've had our hearts broken before. We really believed that was going to happen. It didn't happen. And the space shuttle turned out to be incredibly expensive. Depending on whom you ask, anywhere between $500 million to $1 billion per launch, not counting whatever was in the cargo bay. And, so we didn't get that dramatic drop in cost that we thought was going to revolutionize space, and we all believed that was going to happen. And
well, that's just it. The space shuttle was the very beginning. It was the first baby step. It was born. The commercialization of space was born with the space shuttle.
I don't think that was true, though.
Right.
I mean, we didn't really get much commercialization from the shuttle.
No. I'm saying that was the first concept. And the concept was wrong. It was a lot of flaws in the idea, and it didn't work. But that was the first learning step. It was where we learned from. Now SpaceX comes along and says, "Well, this is where they fucked up. Let's fix this." And in other words, was a step.
It took us 40 years to figure out that wasn't the right approach.
Right. But the fact is that just like in science, you have
NASA
failures. You have failures that teach you a lesson.
Putting a passenger cabin in.
I'm just saying that you have failures, and that was basically a failure in the commercialization. But nevertheless, it was a lesson to be learned.
Yeah, I mean, everybody talks about what an engineering wonder the space shuttle was, and it was in some respects by 70s standards, but it was a failure in the sense that it did not significantly reduce the cost of access to space. And after the Challenger disaster, it was no longer used to send payloads to high energy orbits. And it wasn't the space truck. It wasn't the cheap way to get lots of stuff into space. And suddenly, after 1986, we all are the scales fell from our eyes, and we knew that this was not it. And it took me personally several years to recover from that. From it wasn't just the 7 people died,
right,
which was bad enough. It was that we realized this is not the system that's going to get us into a spacefaring civilization. It's not even close.
Right. It was sold as that, and it wasn't that. On the other hand, that it did exist, and it did make it, taught us those lessons that are hard to learn.
Those lessons were very hard.
In other words, if the space shuttle did not exist, SpaceX might not have existed.
Well,
in other words, you know what I mean? I'm not saying
I don't know
that.
I mean, history is impossible to run. It's possible to run the film backward, but
right. I'm just giving you a sort of what if. In other words, what if the space shuttle never existed and they never learned those lessons?
Well, what if we'd done it right? I mean, what if we made the space shuttle an X program, and
that would have been a whole different story.
And only built one and said, okay, this is too expensive. Let's figure out another way to do reusability. Because the space shuttle main engine was a marvel in engineering, yes, but it was not the way to do reusability. The SSRBs were theoretically reusable, but they didn't really save us that much money. Not enough to make the space shuttle launch cheap.
Right, but it was a first step. It was a first step in learning how to do reusability.
It was how to not do it.
Or how to not do reusability.
The SSME was a hydrogen-oxygen engine. It was a very sophisticated cryogenic engine that had to be completely refurbished after each launch. It was not a cheap way to do it. People were not and when you go back and look at history, people were not thinking in terms of cheap. They're thinking in terms of, here's the requirements. What do I have to do to get this thing into orbit? That's going to land on wheels at Edwards Air Force Base later on. That was, the whole concept was flawed. So
well, there is the Dream Chaser. Sierra Nevada's Dream Chaser is a space plane that will come back to Earth and land on a runway. That's just one NASA's commercial cargo resupply contract.
Yeah, well,
I mean,
they've got to prove that it works yet. I mean, they haven't done that.
They have, but, you know, given them a couple of years, I think, well, late 2019, their first scheduled cargo delivery to the International Space Station.
I have to tell you.
Not that far into the future.
Yeah, go ahead. I have to tell you that Sierra Nevada, they bought out Space Dev, right? I mean, that was Space Dev's idea.
Yeah, Jim Benson.
Jim Benson, who's now since passed away.
Yeah.
I think they might have had a pretty good idea there. The Dream Chaser is not a completely crazy notion, but it's got to be proven in flight before you can.
I think it's beautiful looking space plane.
Yes, it is.
I just want to say one more from the question and answer. Again, the question and answers are kind of cluttered for me, and I wish you would try to clear that up for me. But Cyril Villa also said, if public opinion would be more willing to influence our governments, the money would follow. Unfortunately, there's still a pretty broad section of populations that believe that space exploration investment is a waste of money.
Well,
that was from Cyril Villa.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have, as a community, largely failed to it's not a question of selling it. I don't want to sell it. Selling sounds like something insincere. We've largely failed to make the case. And even though we have these incredibly exciting things coming back from space all the time, everything from New Horizons to Hubble Space Telescope to the Mars, Mars to Curiosity and Opportunity, we still somehow have failed to make the. I think there's two failures here. One thing is the public perceives these things as being extremely expensive on an absolute scale, which they are not, compared to, say, bombing Afghanistan, which is much more expensive. The other thing is the public perceives these things as being kind of stunts, and we're not going to repeat that. We're not going to go back and do it again. And that there, I think, again, we failed to show that this is part of a vision. It's part of a plan, not a plan in the sense of a master plan, but a sense of a commonly shared vision of how we're going to get things done.
I'd like to quote something I read on Virgin Galactic's website, and it says, "Only through the exploration of the unknown can we continue to grow and evolve. Space is not only important for the future of transportation and commerce and science, but it's also important for the future of our imagination."
Well, see, that's I mean, everything that Paul just said and what you just said conforms with the whole thing that I've been trying to do on Google. Just a science enthusiast. I'm not a scientist. I don't have any degrees, but the whole point is literally science literacy. It is what Ciro, however you pronounce his name, is said was, in the public opinion, their lack of science literacy is a problem in the sense that they don't see the benefits. They don't understand the enthusiasm of space exploration and et cetera, and so forth and so on. And it's one of my jobs on I took upon myself was to try to promote the education and things of this nature. This is why it's why I love being part of this podcast. It's we talk about things like this.
Okay. I want to. James has been pretty quiet. James, what's the view from Oklahoma of all this nonsense? James, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear. I've just got some lag going on. It's typical Oklahoma weather. The view around here, I mean, a lot of people got burned by the idea of commercial space exploration around here. It was either one or two companies that came in, got a lot of investors. They were going to put a landing pad and a runway for reusable spacecraft, and as soon as people got enough money, they bolted. They had a huge office building and everything else put up for them, and they just took the money, basically, from my understanding of it, and left. Another kind of common thing about it around, at least with some of the people I know, is that they can't see a direct benefit to space exploration for themselves. You know, they may think it's great for businesses and companies to send people up into space, but it's just they don't see how they're going to get any kind of a benefit out of it.
Yeah, I can understand that. And, people who work in industries or sectors of the economy that are not directly related to that have a hard time seeing that. I wish we had TJ Mulek here, who's now a truck driver. He used to be a space vehicle controller. He might have a different perspective. But TJ's usually on the road and hard to get a hold of. In fact, I think he's been stuck in snow for the last few days. But that's understandable, and I think we need to address that. Mike, you look lost in thought. Mike Bohler, give us some of your thoughts.
Well, I mean, everything that's been said, I think, is valid, and it's like with the space tourism, maybe the driving force behind getting us into space. I'm struggling with the economics, and I think what it's going to come to. I mean, it's as it gets cheaper and cheap. I mean, the idea is to get it cheaper and cheaper to get into space, come out of space. All I'm seeing right now really is trying to see if we can do it, and trying to find way. Like with SpaceX, they seem to be they've got their plans. All the other ones that are mentioned, they've got their plans, but I think it's going to come down to is for it to really work, and I don't know if that would, if it's possible to convince the the layperson out there, but there's got to be a good reason to go into space, and it can't be just to. I don't think selling it as, well, we could just you can buzz around the asteroids, or go to take a spa holiday on Mars or whatever. I don't think that's going to convince a lot of people to support this. But I think if because I can remember hearing things like like pharmaceuticals being able to be if you produce it in zero gravity, there might be some benefits there. I know there's experiments about growing plants. There may be because if they could link the idea that we might be needing to start looking at space as extra space to, grow food, produce electronics, or produce pharmaceuticals, or do whatever and if it, unfortunately, I think we're not at that point because it's just too expensive to even with the SpaceX, and because I think you're mentioning, even with the big drop in cost, it's still up there. I mean, it's still cheaper to build a pharmaceutical plant on terra firma and do the stuff here. I mean, training, the extra training to put a person on a space station to make pharmaceuticals. You got the getting that equipment up there, or figuring out ways to build the equipment in space. I think in previous podcasts, talking about mining asteroids, getting the iron and whatever materials off an asteroid and bring it to a place to assemble it or refine it, whatever they got to do. And then, I mean, there's just, I think it's definitely too soon to even begin to speculate what will happen, but just having people who are spending their own money, and that should say something, that these guys are spending their own money or borrowing the money, getting, investors interested in getting us a cheaper way to get into space. I mean, I don't know what it costs to put a satellite now with the standard rockets we're using, but if these guys are coming up with cheaper lift capabilities, and where they could even the scheduling might even be easier than, I mean, I don't know how, if I wanted to get a satellite up, how long it would take from me saying go for it to getting it in orbit, if that's a year or two, versus these guys who can put it up in 6 weeks. I mean, that then there's going to be some benefits there, and I think
the cycle time is still probably the fastest you can do is about 18 months, but so you have to plan ahead.
Yeah, but definitely.
But I mean, a commercial Falcon 9, I don't take these as round numbers, please, not as quotes, because I don't work for SpaceX, but about $60 million for a Falcon 9, which is, believe me, that is a huge advance. That's about a factor of 2 reduction in launch costs. Maybe in a factor of 3 or 4, depending on who you're comparing to. Yep. So now a NASA Falcon 9 will cost more, because NASA has additional requirements that SpaceX has to meet that have very little to do with delivering mass to orbit. But and of course the Dragon capsule costs money. It's not, they don't give that away for free. That's what takes the cargo up to the space station and docks with the space station. Although, part of this is repeatability, getting things, doing a lot of these things, doing them repeatedly, doing them frequently, which is why commercial goods cost a little now, why something as sophisticated as a top drawer cell phone now costs less than $1,000, which 10 years ago would have been impossible to get for any price. That is, that's part of it. We're sort of latching on to this notion, to this incredible growth we've seen in the information technology industry, where we've gone. I remember, I think I said something today on Google Plus. So I remember in 1980s paying $900 a piece for 80 megabyte hard drives. Not 80 gigabyte, 80 megabyte hard drives. Roughly 1/10,000th of the capacity which you buy today routinely for $60. So we're talking about a factor of 100,000 in improvement, beyond, or even more than that. Maybe closer to 1 million since the late 80s in information technology. Rockets, maybe a factor of 2 or 3. So rockets are behind that curve because rockets have to deal with energy, right, and materials, and not just information. So, but that's been the inspiration, that this incredible growth that nobody forecasted in 1980 that we've seen between now and then, in those 36 years, that going from basically nobody had a hard drive in 1980 to now everybody's got a 2 terabyte hard drive. If you're a cheapskate, you have a 2 terabyte hard drive. You could not, in 1980, you could not buy a 2 terabyte hard drive for any price. If you had a $500 million to spend, you couldn't get one. You had to buy a whole farm of, 100 megabyte hard drives. That is that kind of exponential growth and that kind of exponential reduction in cost has not been seen in the space industry. And now the space industry wants to emulate that. And, well, we're not going to, even if we could get a factor of 10, just 10 reduction in cost to space, we will enable apps that we haven't even envisioned yet. We may get to Gerard K. O'Neill's vision of being able to build massive human habitats in space. And, I remember 1978. I don't know, most of you probably are too young to remember that. In 1978, I was in a university in the Midwest, and Gerard K. O'Neill came to speak, and it was sold out. The whole room was full of enthusiastic young people. I heard Gerard K. O'Neill come to talk about the high frontier. And Gerard K. O'Neill came and talked about putting human habitats all over the solar system, hollowing out asteroids, L5, L4, the moon. All that was not doable then because the launch costs were so high. And here's what I'd like to put to you, that what people like Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin and Sierra Nevada are doing now is maybe driven by tourism and maybe driven by commercial crew or commercial cargo from NASA. But what it's really going to lead to is a massive reduction in launch cost. And that reduction in launch cost could get us closer to O'Neill's vision than anything we've seen in the last 45 years, maybe even in my lifetime.
Well, isn't that why SpaceX is so popular? Because they are working so hard to try and give us a real reusable rocket. And they may have failed on a couple of landings, but the fact is that if they can make this thing land safely and then clean it up and reuse it again and land safely again, etc., this is the whole idea.
Well, right. Reusability is one way to cut launch costs. Reusability is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. And the end is cutting launch costs, right? Cutting cost of access to space. And if you can do that, and I strongly feel Elon Musk is driven by this whole idea of a human civilization that exists beyond Earth, permanently, sustainably, and in a very open and growing sense, the next industrial revolution, in a sense. Now, a lot of people are saying the next industrial revolution is artificial intelligence. The competing concept is the next industrial revolution is space development.
Well, that's just the, I don't see it that way. Even though I disagree with those people who say that. Artificial intelligence is just one, to me anyway, is one of those tangents. It's one of those things that come along with the idea. I'm going to give you an analogy. We all drive cars now, and not all of us own cars. But the fact is, it's a vehicle. Now, this is a vehicle that started from the Industrial Revolution to take you to places in a convenient way and take you further, and to go visit grandma who happens to live in another state, and et cetera, so forth and so on, and get to your job, which is 10 miles away, and you can't just get there by walking. You don't, and this is one of those things where I always wondered why NASA, crash landed their spacecraft into planets. It's one of those things where you don't buy a car to drive to grandma's house and then leave it there or drop it off somewhere and find another car to come back home. It's a reusable vehicle, and this is the kind of thing that's not going to happen in my lifetime, but it is, like I said before, we are at the cusp of making that happen. In other words, just like Star Wars, everybody, these guys, Han Solo had his Falcon, spacecraft, which everybody called a piece of junk, but was a wonderful spacecraft that he kept fixing and everything. The point is that it was a spacecraft that he used to get around in. And
okay, we need to point out that was fiction, right? That was fiction.
Well, I'm just giving an analogy.
Yeah.
In other words, it's not just a spacecraft that gets used once and gets thrown away. It's a spacecraft that's been around for a long time, and it gets used to take him everywhere he wanted to go, and et cetera, and so forth. It's just like your car. You go to work in your car, and it drives you tens of miles away, and it goes on for years. And when I got rid of my Buick Skylark, it had enough miles on it to reach the moon. So it's pretty amazing when you think about it that way. We need that kind of vehicular reusability. We need, and that's not going to be in my lifetime, I'm sure.
Well,
but it will be one day.
How long you planning to live, Patrick?
I don't think it's going to happen in the next 50 years. I'm already 56, and
a youngster. Okay. I tell you what, folks, we're already past our traditional hour, so I'm going to give you each of us a chance to wrap up. Also, remember, we've got this new feature called Recommendations, where you get to recommend something. It could be anything that you want to recommend, from a website to a museum to a movie to a CD to a blog, a book, even a book. Yeah. So I'm going to start. Sorry, Adam, you're on my left. So for some reason, you always pop up there on the left of my screen. Maybe it's just like it goes from east to west. I don't know. No, that wouldn't make sense. James is west of my. No, never mind.
You'd be west. Yeah, you'd be west of me. So.
Let's hear a wrap up and a recommendation from Adam Synergy Smith.
Okay. Well, here we are in 2016. We've put around 550 people into space in the past 45 years. I honestly believe that getting more and more people across the final frontier into space is the key to human advancement. It will inspire the next generation of thinkers, entrepreneurs, inventors, scientists, and ordinary people to help spawn new industries, advance our understanding of human physiology, human ingenuity. Space is hard. It's hard to get people into space. But in doing so, we show ourselves just what marvelous things we can achieve if we try. And there's also such thing as the overview effect. Astronauts often report on how their outlook on life is completely transformed by being able to look down on the Earth, look at how beautiful the Earth is. And when they do that, they don't see borders. There are no borders. Borders are artificial lines drawn on maps that we fight over and kill each other over. But they're imaginary lines. There are not these physical boundaries between countries. And you can see that from space. As a recommendation, I would like to recommend something I mentioned a little while ago, a TV show called The Expanse. It's excellent. So if you haven't seen it, find it and watch it.
Okay, thanks, Adam. That was great. And I think the overview effect is probably more important than we think. And I definitely plan to check out The Expanse. James.
Yeah, this has been pretty interesting. I think the idea of space tourism may be a good way to help finance more projects, more research, because tourism's a pretty, I mean, it sounds bad, but it's a quick and easy way a lot of times to earn a lot of money fast. You look at some countries that have very few resources, but they're able to get people to come in and spend a lot of money by taking them on, by letting them be eco-tourists or just doing tourism in general, and that helps boost the economy, helps get things going. So I think space tourism, even though it sounds corny, it sounds like something right out of, the 50s and 60s of people going to the moon for a day trip. It's still probably the best way to help, offset some of the costs of other projects that may be coming down the pike later. And go ahead, Paul.
Go ahead. What's your recommendation, James?
My recommendation is going to be, I've been thinking about this, and there's 3 or 4 things, and I didn't want to be completely narcissistic and push my stuff, so I'm going to say I'd like to promote, or at least recommend people check out Camp Quest. And there's actually 2 of them. One of them is a kind of a secular humanist summer camp for kids. So they do a lot of good work, and it's a pretty interesting organization. Okay,
Camp Quest. All right. Mm-hmm. And which I've heard good things about, by the way.
We finally got one here in Oklahoma, and we're trying to do a little bit to help them get some more kids coming, get some more people interested in what they're doing.
Yeah, I've promised my son that we might go storm chasing in Oklahoma someday, so maybe we'll do that at Camp Quest.
Yeah, let me know when you're out here.
Yeah, because you guys have all the bad weather that everybody's interested in.
Yeah, but they kind of morph everything into one. Cause we had a ice NATO earthquake all at once.
That's a perfect storm as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, but not when you're in the middle of it.
Mike Bohler.
Oh, final thought. I'm always, I am a firm believer that we will be, our future's in space. We're going to go, and I think getting a government to pay or get that going, that's at least my opinion, my personal, and not, a government's not going to do it. It's going to be the private sector, and seeing the growth and the expansion of like the SpaceXs and all those where it's going into the private hands, because there seems to be more incentive for a private to cut costs to get, to accomplish this. I think what we're going to see a lot more SpaceX. We're going to hear a lot more from SpaceX. There probably a few other competitors probably in the wings right now trying to figure out how to get into the business. But I think we're going to see a lot of private investment into getting into space, and because they do recognize that we're going to go. And I'm 53, so and I actually think I'm going to see it in my lifetime. So Patrick, don't be so pessimistic. So I really do believe, because it has been leaps and bounds. I mean, the costs. I mean, sure, it's going to be slow going, but I would think within 10 years that 2 may go to 5, and then 10 years down to the 10 that you have said that would be a major boost to get us into space. So, of course, hopefully if we have a lot of good reasons. I mean, I don't think we can rely totally on space tourism to get this to happen. There's going to be an industrial, or at least some type of manufacturing, mining, whatever is going to be a important part too. But of course the costs are going to have to come down. That's why I'm thinking within 20 years we probably will start seeing products coming down from space instead of sending stuff up all the time. And I don't really have any recommendations, so
okay, no recommendation. All right, Patrick, you get the penultimate word.
Well, in the spirit of Google, I want to +1 everything Adam said. I want to +1 everything James said about the space quest. That is the camp that he's talking about. As far as what I'm thinking, it's the idea that as Ciro had said in the question and answer, there is a opinion poll which I can't stand, but there's a public opinion is a problem. The problem is science literacy. And in the words of Neil deGrasse Tyson, there is a problem with that in this country. So in like I said, I'm going to +1 everything Adam said in that spirit. So for my recommendation, and I've done this recommendation before in these hangouts in the Unseen podcast, but it seems like because I'm experiencing deja vu tonight, because we have talked about this once before, I'm going to recommend the same thing I did the last time we talked about this. The Earth Unaware, Earth Fire, and Earth Awakens. Oh Jesus! The author just suddenly slipped my mind. It was the same guy who made the movie. Wow, I'm sorry. I'm a little nervous. When I get nervous, I forget. Ender's Game. It's that series.
Orson Scott Card.
Yeah, Orson Scott Card. Thank you. In that series, those 3 books I just mentioned, it's all about the commercialization of space, and there's the miners and the free miners, and there is one big company. I'm not going to give any. I'm not going to give
no
anything
spoilers, please. Thank you.
Yeah, no spoilers. But there is, in fact, a major person involved in actually controlling the entire place on Luna. But the point is, it's about commercialization of space and things like that. And there is because it's sci-fi, there's a war, there's an alien invasion, and they finally get a hold of the idea that this is actually true, and the Earth comes together. But the point of the matter is that it's about mining space, and the science is semi-accurate. It is very interesting. It was written some time ago, so there's going to be some inaccuracies, but it is science fiction after all. But I highly recommend Orson Scott Card's series of the Earth Unaware, Earth Afire, and Earth Awakens series. And then, of course, The Ender's Game, which actually was a book written before all those 3. It was sort of prequels. Yeah. In any case, there you go.
Yeah, Ender's Game is a very fine book.
Well, it was actually written long before the other 3, and it was actually. It's hard to explain. In fact, I'm still trying to figure it out. But the fact is that the kid who made
Ender.
Yeah, Bender. Well, it's a long story, but the kid actually turned around and tried to find another planet for the alien invaders. But in any case, the whole war that started with it was a lot different.
Yeah. Okay.
any case, I don't want to give any spoilers away.
All right. Thanks, Patrick. Okay. Well, my final word about this whole topic is that let's get the cost down to access to space. I have my own ideas of what we can do. There are two aspects to this. One is getting the cost per pound down. One is getting higher payoff payloads into smaller platforms so we can get, for less mass, we can get the same bang for the buck. Of course, that doesn't involve taking people to space. That involves taking little tiny robots to space. People going to space is always going to be a very high mass proposition. We take our bodies and we take our brains to space. It's going to cost us a lot of money. But it'll cost us less money. And at some point, we'll get to the point where more of us can go, and we'll have had tiny little robots that go ahead of us that tell us exactly where we're going and what we're doing. Ultimately, that gets us to Mars. It gets us to Ceres. It gets us to the science fiction vision that we're seeing now. I'm very encouraged by the increase in hard science fiction in the theaters today. I'm not talking about Star Wars, of course. I'm talking about The Martian. I'm talking about, a few years ago, the Europa Report. I'm talking about even kind of dystopian films like Ex Machina. A lot of hard science involved and very realistic idea of what, not of where we're actually going, but where we could go. So hopefully we'll be there. Now, my recommendation has nothing to do with any of that. My recommendation is just a movie I saw last weekend, very late at night when everybody else was asleep, on the Apple TV, which is a 2010 film that came out that you probably haven't seen, but directed by Julie Taymor. It's called The Tempest. Now, The Tempest, of course, is a Shakespeare play that was written 400 years ago. Some people say it was Shakespeare's last play. It's certainly a very powerful, mature work. But what Taymor did, she took the lead role of Prospero and turned it into a female role of Prospera, and she picked one of the finest actors of either gender in the English language, Helen Mirren, to play Prospera. And it is a total triumph for Helen Mirren. She does a fantastic job as Prospera. And some of the famous speeches that are Prospero's become Helen Mirren's, and she just knocks them out of the park. So and yet the film respects Shakespeare's culture, his vision, his time. It's just beautiful. It's called The Tempest. It was put out in 2010, and it was directed by Julie Taymor, starring Helen Mirren. And the whole cast is fine, but Mirren is just great. And that's my recommendation. So thanks for listening again. This is the Unseen Podcast. Go to unseenpodcast.com. This is episode 41. Please let us know what you thought of this episode. Give us your ideas. Give us your recommendations. Let us know what who you think we should have on the podcast. We'll take negative criticism. We'll take violently unseen podcast criticism, anything. Let us know what you think. We want to stir up emotions, even if they're hate. Give us your hate if you have hate. Give us your love if you got love. The next week, we don't know what the topic's going to be yet. We're still working on that. But next week is episode 42. So you can kind of guess that it's going to be a sort of an Adamsian theme, and maybe something having to do with mice. So we'd like to see you next week. Now, episode 43, 2 weeks from today, Mateusz Macias has worked hard to line up Bob Novella as our special guest. Bob is a member of the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe Rogues panel, and we hope. And so he'll be our guest panelist. And so let us know what you think we should talk to Bob about. And you can, if you have any questions, comments, criticisms, you could email unseenpodcast@gmail.com. That's one way to get in touch with us. You can go to the blog at unseenpodcast.com and comment directly on the blog post for each episode. We also have an Unseen Podcast listeners community and Google Plus, and also on Reddit. So there are lots of ways you can make yourself heard. We are listening to all of those channels. So let us know what you think. If you'd like to be on the panel for an Unseen podcast, you can be on the panel. Send me an email at unseenpodcast@gmail.com. If you are willing to stand up and use your real name and be who you really are and be on the panel and express and open your heart to the world, you can be on the Unseen podcast. You can even host the Unseen podcast. Now, both James and Adam are here. They've both been hosted this podcast before. I'm hoping to cultivate many more hosts as time goes on. So, thank you very much. If you want to support this podcast, go to patreon.com/unseenpodcast and make it very, very small donation. Do not give us a lot of money. We don't deserve it. Okay. If you give $1 to us, give at least $10 to Alzheimer's research, and $10 to cancer research, and $10 to fighting hunger and disease in Africa. But if you have, out of your $100, you have $1 left, give it to Unseen Podcast, and we will put it to good use, I promise. So, thank you very much. I'd like to thank our panelists, Adam Synergy Smith.
Thank you, Paul.
James Garrison.
Thanks, Paul.
Mike Bohler.
Thanks, Paul.
And the indomitable Patrick Festa.
Indomitable? Well, it's a pleasure as always.
And music by DJ Spooky. We'll see you next week at episode 42. Of course, that's going to be a special episode with special sentiment. So this is the 29th of January, 2016. This is episode 41 of the Unseen Podcast. Good night. See you next week.